My wife looked me in the eye and said, "Your brother is the father of my baby." I stayed quiet. She had no idea that I had already spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment. Hi, welcome to my channel. I appreciate you joining me for this story. After 4 years of marriage, on a Tuesday evening in our study, my wife didn't look at me with the warmth I once knew. She looked at me with a desperate kind of honesty and said, "Nathan, your brother Evan is the biological father of Noah." She waited for me to shatter, to scream, or to cast her out. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply checked the time on my watch, closed my laptop, and walked to the safe in the corner of the room. In that moment, she had no realization that the trap had already been set and the doors were already locking behind her. Thank you for being here. Before we dive into the details of how this unfolded, I'd love to know who is watching today. Drop your city or country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Just a quick note, this story includes fictional elements for storytelling and strategic insight. While names and locations are coincidental, the lessons on vigilance and professional composure are very real. There are moments in a life built on logic that split your world into a before and an after. Mine arrived on a Tuesday in the late afternoon, while the sun was hitting the glass of my office window and the rest of our high-end neighborhood was settling into the quiet rhythm of the evening. Everything looked exactly the way a successful life was supposed to look. I am sitting in my study now, long after the house has gone silent, with a glass of water I haven't touched in 2 hours. I'm looking at a manila envelope that has been sitting in my desk drawer for 21 days. The truth didn't break me. It simply confirmed what my spreadsheets had already told me. The envelope had been sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk for 21 days, its weight far greater than the few ounces of paper inside. It was a standard, nondescript manila mailer, the kind used for mundane tax documents or architectural blueprints. There was no return address, only a stamp from a private laboratory in North Carolina and my name, Nathan Cole, typed in a font so sterile it felt like a diagnosis. I remember the afternoon it arrived. It was a Friday, the kind of day where the sunlight feels deceptive, warm on the skin while the air remains sharp. Sophie was in the kitchen, humming a melody I didn't recognize while she prepared a bottle for Noah. Evan was there, too, leaning against our marble countertop with that easy, athletic grace that had always made me feel stiff by comparison. He was laughing, telling some story about a client at his gym, his eyes darting towards Sophie for a beat too long. I had walked past them with the envelope tucked under my arm, my face a mask of professional exhaustion. "Late night at the office, Nathan?" Evan had called out, his voice thick with a charm that felt like a serrated edge. I didn't turn around. I simply nodded, entered my study, and locked the door. When I finally broke the seal, I didn't tremble. My training as a financial consultant has taught me that numbers do not have feelings, they only have truths. I bypassed the legal jargon and the technical charts of genetic markers until I reached the final line of the summary. The probability of paternity was 0%. In that moment, the air in the room seemed to crystallize. Every memory of the last year, the late-night training sessions Evan gave Sophie, the way they both fell silent when I entered a room, the subtle, inexplicable drain on our liquid assets, suddenly aligned into a perfect, devastating ledger. I looked at the photograph of Noah on my desk. He had the cold chin, but as I studied the DNA report, I realized he didn't have my eyes. He had Evan's. A normal man would have stormed out of that study. A normal man would have swung at his brother and demanded an explanation from his wife. But I am not a normal man, I am a strategist. I understood immediately that a confrontation was a losing move. If I reacted then, I would be the emotional husband in a messy divorce, likely losing half of my estate and the house I had built to a woman who had betrayed me and a brother who had robbed me. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I placed the report back in the envelope, slid it into the hidden compartment of my safe, and adjusted my tie in the mirror. When I walked back out for dinner, I was smiling. I poured Evan a glass of expensive scotch and asked him how his business was doing. I was no longer a husband or a brother. I was an auditor, and the investigation had only just begun. The following Monday, I returned to the sanctuary of my office, not to work for my clients, but to audit the wreckage of my own life. I sat in the glow of triple monitors, my fingers moving across the keys with the practiced rhythm of a man performing a digital autopsy. To an outsider, I was merely a consultant analyzing market volatility. In reality, I was tracing the hemorrhage of my own heart through the cold medium of bank statements. I started with a private credit card Sophie kept for her personal expenses, the one she assumed I never looked at because I trusted her. It was a card meant for Nordstrom hauls and weekend brunches, but the data told a different story. There was a recurring pattern of high-value charges at a high-end supplement wholesaler and a commercial equipment lease company. None of it belonged in Sophie's world. They belonged in Evan's. I pulled up the public filings for Peak Performance, the boutique gym my brother had opened with such fanfare 2 years ago. On paper, it was a success. On the back end, it was a sinking ship. I watched the cash flow like a predator watching a wounded animal. For 18 months, every time Evan's business account hit the red, a personal gift or a consulting fee from Sophie's account would appear like a life raft. The total was staggering. Over $80,000 had been siphoned from our joint savings into the pockets of a man who was already stealing my family. As I looked at the timestamps, the cruelty of it became surgical. A $5,000 transfer was made on the same day Evan stood in our backyard, drinking my beer and complaining about the rising costs of his equipment. Sophie had been standing right next to him, her hand resting briefly on his arm in a gesture I had mistaken for sisterly support. It wasn't just an affair, it was an extraction. My brother wasn't just a fitness coach, he was a parasite, and my wife was his willing host. She wasn't just giving him her body, she was handing him the future I had spent 20 years building. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my glasses. A younger, more impulsive version of Nathan Cole would have felt the urge to burn it all down. But as I watched the cursor blink, I felt a strange, cold clarity. Anger is a volatile asset, it clouds one's judgment. I needed to remain liquid. I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it Project Liquidation. If Evan wanted my money, I would give him exactly what he asked for, but I would do it on my terms. I would become the primary creditor of his failing dreams. By the time I was finished, every penny they had taken would be a link in the chain I was forging for them. I closed the browser, grabbed my coat, and headed home to play the part of the unsuspecting husband for one more night. The Sunday sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our breakfast nook, illuminating the scene with a warmth that felt entirely unearned. On the surface, it was a tableau of domestic perfection. The smell of expensive roast coffee and maple syrup filled the air, and the soft clink of silverware against porcelain provided the soundtrack to our weekly family brunch. I sat at the head of the table, my posture as disciplined as my thoughts. Across from me, Evan was holding Noah. He was doing that thing he always did, playing the part of the doting uncle with a performative intensity that bordered on the cinematic. He bounced the baby on his knee, flashing a rugged, dimpled smile that had likely charmed dozens of investors out of their capital and Sophie out of her vows. "He's getting so big, Nate," Evan said, looking up at me with eyes that were bright and seemingly guileless. "He's got that Cole energy. Can't keep him still." I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching him over the rim of the cup. I wasn't looking at my brother, I was looking at a thief in a designer tracksuit. Every time he adjusted the baby's blanket, I didn't see affection. I saw the way his fingers had metaphorically dipped into my retirement accounts. Every charming laugh he directed toward Sophie, who was fussing over a platter of fruit with a frantic, nervous energy, was a data point. I noted the way Sophie's eyes lingered on him, a mixture of adoration and terrifying guilt. She laughed at a joke he hadn't even finished yet, her voice a pitch too high. To anyone else, they looked like a tight-knit family. To me, they looked like two amateurs playing a game they had already lost. "You're quiet today, Nathan," Sophie said, her hand momentarily brushing Evan's shoulder as she reached for the carafe. The contact was brief, but in the clinical silence of my mind, it registered like a siren. "Just thinking about the gym, Evan," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any jagged edges. "You mentioned the equipment lease was weighing on you. I'd hate to see Peak Performance struggle after all the work you've put in." Evan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a microscopic glitch in his persona, before smoothing back into place. It's just a growth phase, man. You know how it is. High overhead, high reward. I nodded, offering a thin, encouraging smile. He had no idea that I had spent the previous night memorizing the exact terms of that lease. He didn't know that the anonymous entity currently negotiating to buy out his debt was a shell company I had registered 3 days ago. I watched him kiss the top of Noah's head, a child that was biologically his, sustained by money that was legally mine. A wave of cold, crystalline resolve settled over me. I wasn't angry. Anger is for people who lack a plan. I simply reached out and adjusted the salt shaker on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of my placemat. The pieces were moving. The brunch was an act, and I was the only one in the room who knew exactly when the curtain would fall. The offices of Sterling and Vance were located on the 34th floor, a glass and steel fortress that overlooked the city's financial district. Inside, the air was conditioned to a precise, cool temperature, and the only sound was the muted hum of a server room somewhere deep in the building. I sat across from Julian Vance, a man who had been my personal attorney and a family friend for over a decade. He looked at the documents I had placed on his desk, then back at me, his expression unreadable. "You're certain about the timing of this, Nathan?" Julian asked, his voice low. "A total restructuring of the family trust while your wife is still in the recovery phase of a pregnancy is aggressive. If this goes to a contested divorce later, a judge might look at this as an attempt to hide assets." I leaned back, my hands resting calmly on the leather arms of my chair. "It isn't an attempt to hide assets, Julian. It's an attempt to correct a clerical error. I've lived my life under the assumption that the lineage of my estate was clear. New information has surfaced that necessitates a more surgical definition of descendant. I didn't tell him about the DNA report in my safe. I didn't need to. Julian was paid to be efficient, not curious. I watched as he pulled up my current trust, a document I had signed 3 years ago with a heart full of misguided loyalty. At the time, it was a standard all to spouse, then to children setup. It was a document built for a man who believed in the sanctity of his home. "I want their clause amended," I said, my voice steady. "The trust is to be restricted exclusively to biological descendants of the Cole line, verified by a court-admissible forensic test at the time of my passing. Furthermore, I want a spendthrift provision added that specifically bars any beneficiary from using trust funds to pay off third-party debts, specifically commercial equipment leases or personal loans." Julian's pen hovered over the paper. He knew Evan's business was failing. He wasn't a fool. He made a quick note, the scratch of the nib sounding like a sharp blade against the silence. "And the power of attorney?" he asked. "Revoked," I replied. "Effective immediately. My medical and financial decisions will now fall to a corporate trustee. Sophie is to be removed from all signature authority on the primary accounts by the end of business today." By the time I stood up to leave, the paperwork was ready. It was a paper guillotine, silent and invisible to those who weren't looking for it. Sophie and Evan were still playing house, imagining a future funded by my labor and my name. They didn't realize that while they were focused on the cradle, I had already dismantled the floor beneath them. I shook Julian's hand, walked out to the elevator, and watched the city lights flicker as I descended. The assets were locked. The line was drawn. All that remained was the execution. The following Friday, I invited Evan to my study. The room was bathed in the amber glow of the evening sun, a setting designed to suggest intimacy and familial warmth. I had a bottle of 20-year-old scotch breathing on the sideboard and a set of documents laid out on the desk with calculated nonchalance. Evan entered with his usual swagger, though I could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the look of a man who had spent the morning dodging calls from creditors. "You said you wanted to talk business, Nate? Usually, you tell me to keep my gym talk for the weekends." I poured him a glass, the liquid catching the light like liquid gold. "I've been thinking about what you said at brunch, Evan. About growth phases. It occurred to me that I've been so focused on my own portfolio that I've neglected the potential right here in the family." I watched him take a seat, his eyes darting to the papers. I could see the hunger in him, that desperate, reckless need for a win that makes a man blind to the fine print. I've set up a private investment vehicle, I continued, my voice as smooth as the Scotch. It's a bridge loan, specifically for expansion. No banks, no red tape. Just a direct infusion of $200,000 to clear your current leases and fund the new studio you've been talking about. Evan's hand tightened around his glass. 200,000? Nathan, that's a game changer. What's the catch? No catch, I lied, the word tasting like iron. Just a standard promissory note. High interest, yes, because I have to answer to my partners, but the principal isn't due for 12 months. It gives you air to breathe. All I need is for you to sign as the personal guarantor. He didn't even look for the name of the lending entity, Vanguard Strategic Holdings. He didn't ask who the silent partners were. He saw the number at the top and the space for his signature at the bottom. He saw a way to keep his failing gym alive and keep his lifestyle with my wife afloat. You're a lifesaver, T. Seriously, he said, his voice thick with a relief that was almost pathetic. He scrawled his name with a flourish, the ink still wet as he handed the paper back to me. I smiled, a thin, controlled expression. I wasn't saving his life, I was purchasing it. By signing as the personal guarantor, Evan had just tied his entire financial existence to a debt I now personally owned through 3 layers of shell companies. The interest was predatory, designed to compound at a rate his gym could never outrun. As he stood up and clapped me on the shoulder, calling me the best brother a guy could have, I felt the finality of the trap click into place. He thought he had just secured his future. In reality, he had just handed me the leash. I walked him to the door, watching him disappear down the hallway toward the kitchen, toward Sophie, toward the child he thought he had stolen. He was walking with a lighter step, unaware that with every stride he was moving deeper into the debt that would eventually bury him. The atmosphere in our home had shifted from a warm sanctuary to a pressurized chamber, though to an outside observer, nothing had changed. I continued to be the provider, the silent pillar, and the man who appeared to notice nothing. But silence has a weight of its own, and after 3 weeks, Sophie was beginning to buckle under its mass. She began watching me with a frantic, darting intensity. During dinner, she would linger over her plate, her fork scraping against the porcelain in a rhythmic, jagged sound that betrayed her nerves. I would look up from my tablet, offer a polite, empty smile, and ask her how her day had been. I didn't probe. I didn't challenge. I simply gave her nothing, no suspicion, but no intimacy either. For a woman living a double life, my lack of questions was becoming more terrifying than an interrogation. Nathan, she said one evening, her voice trembling as she stood by the nursery door. You've been so distant lately. Is it work? You're here, but you're not really here. I didn't look up from the financial reports I was reviewing. I'm just focused, Sophie. There are a lot of moving parts right now. It requires a certain level of detachment to ensure everything stays on track. The irony was a jagged blade, but she was too consumed by her own shadows to feel the edge. She walked toward me, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood. I could smell her perfume, the same soft, floral scent that had once brought me peace, now a reminder of the lies she told in the dark. She reached out to touch my shoulder, but I shifted slightly to reach for my pen, a move so subtle it appeared accidental, yet it left her hand hanging in the cold air. The crack finally gave way on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my study, the very room where I had once kept her secrets safe from my own heart. The air was still, the only sound the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Sophie entered without knocking. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 21 days drowning and had finally decided to stop fighting the current. She didn't wait for me to speak. She didn't wait for a sign. She simply stood in the center of the rug, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, and looked me in the eye. Nathan, she whispered, the word breaking in the middle. I can't do this anymore. The silence. I need you to know the truth. Evan's your brother, he's the father of my baby. I didn't gasp. I didn't stand up. I didn't even blink. I simply sat there, the master of the board, watching as she finally played the move I had spent 3 weeks forcing her to make. I looked at the clock. It was 5:14 p.m. The trap had officially closed. The silence that followed her confession was not the heavy, suffocating kind she had likely expected. It was the sterile, vacuum-sealed silence of a laboratory. Sophie stood there, her chest heaving, waiting for the explosion, the shouting, the shattered glass, the righteous fury of a husband betrayed. I didn't give it to her. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the surface of my desk, and looked at her with the same neutral curiosity I used when a client presented a balance sheet that didn't add up. "I see," I said. My voice was calm, pitched at a conversational level that seemed to unnerve her more than a scream ever could. "You see," she stammered, her eyes widening as she searched my face for a flicker of pain. "Nathan, did you hear me? Noah isn't yours. I've been with Evan for years. I'm so sorry Sophie, please," I interrupted, raising a hand just an inch off the desk. "Apologies are a liability in this room. They don't change the data. If we are going to discuss this, we need to be precise." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and my fountain pen. I uncapped the pen with a slow, deliberate twist. Sophie watched the movement as if I were handling a weapon. "I'm going to need a detailed timeline," I said, meeting her gaze. "For my records. We'll start with the first instance of physical contact. Dates, locations, and the duration of the overlap with our shared residence. I also need a full accounting of any financial discussions you had with Evan regarding my personal accounts or the family trust." "Your records," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Nathan, I just told you our marriage is a lie, and you want a timeline? Are you even human?" "I am a man who values accuracy, Sophie. You've spent the last 2 years treating our life as a work of fiction. I'm simply asking for the non-fiction version so I can adjust my projections accordingly." I began to write a header at the top of the page. Chronology of breach. "Did it start during the lake house trip 3 years ago?" I asked, my pen hovering over the paper. "Or was it earlier during the Christmas gala? Think carefully. Discrepancies at this stage will only make the subsequent legal proceedings more complicated for you." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the realization dawn on her. She had come here expecting a husband she could manipulate with tears and guilt, a man she could eventually beg for forgiveness. Instead, she found an auditor. She had finally confessed her truth, only to realize that I wasn't interested in her heart. I was interested in her deposition. "Start at the beginning," I prompted, my voice as cold and steady as a ticking clock. "And don't leave out the money. We both know that's what Evan was really after." The yellow legal pad was no longer blank. It was covered in the jagged architecture of Sophie's betrayal, a map of clandestine meetings and financial drains that she had tearfully confessed over the last hour. She sat across from me, her face blotchy and her spirit seemingly spent, perhaps imagining that this honesty would be the first step toward a messy, emotional reconciliation. I set the pen down. The click of the cap was the final punctuation mark on our marriage. "Thank you for the clarity, Sophie," I said, my voice devoid of the tremor she so desperately wanted to hear. It's rare that a defendant provides such a comprehensive roadmap for their own displacement. She blinked, the tears drying as a new kind of fear took hold. "Displacement? Nathan, I told you the truth because I couldn't live with the lie. I know it's bad, but we have a son. We have a life. We have a contract," I corrected. I reached into the manila envelope I had brought from the safe and slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany. "This is the prenuptial agreement we both signed 4 years ago. Specifically, page 12, section 4, the morality and lineage clause." Sophie's eyes scanned the text, her breath hitching. I didn't need to read it to her. I knew the words by heart. It stated that in the event of proven infidelity or the birth of a child resulting from an extramarital affair, all claims to marital assets, alimony, and the primary residence were forfeited. It was a clause I had insisted upon, not out of suspicion, but out of a professional habit of hedging against high-risk variables. "You can't do this," she whispered. "A judge won't." "A judge will look at this," I said, sliding a second document over the first. It was the DNA report. 0% probability of paternity. Between your recorded confession and this forensic evidence, your status in this house transitioned from wife to guest exactly 12 minutes ago. The silence that followed was absolute. The soft elegance she had maintained for years seemed to wither, leaving only the impulse and guilt that had driven her to Evan. She looked at the paper, then at me, realizing that while she was playing a game of emotions, I had been conducting a liquidation. I've already had the locks on the wine cellar and the primary safe changed, I continued, my tone as clinical as a weather report. Your personal belongings have been packed into the guest suite. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises. My legal team will handle the service of the formal papers. And Noah? She gasped, her voice reaching a pitch of pure panic. Noah is a Cole by name for now, I said, my eyes hardening. And since he is staying in the only home he has ever known, I suggest you go to the guest room and begin deciding what you actually own. Because as of this moment, Sophie, you own nothing in this house, least of all my mercy. The smell of stale sweat and expensive rubber hung heavy in the air of peak performance as I stepped through the glass doors. It was after hours, the neon lights of the gym humming with a low, electric buzz. Evan was at the front desk, his athletic frame hunched over a laptop, the frantic tapping of his keys echoing in the empty space. When he looked up and saw me, a flash of genuine relief crossed his face, the look of a man who still believed his brother was his final safety net. Nate. Man, I was just about to call you, Evan said, forcing that signature grin. The equipment guys are being aggressive again. I need to draw down a bit more from that bridge loan we signed. Just $50,000 to keep them off my back until the new memberships kick in. I didn't smile back. I walked to the center of the gym, my leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the reinforced flooring. I looked at the rows of high-end treadmills and the squat racks, assets I had technically owned for the last 72 hours. The bridge loan is closed, Evan, I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the neon. In fact, the entire credit facility has been called in. Default notice was served to your registered agent at 4 p.m. today. Evan's laugh was nervous, a jagged sound. What are you talking about? We have 12 months on the principal. You said? I said the principal was due in 12 months. I interrupted, my tone as flat as a dial tone. But Section 8 of the promissory note, the part you didn't read, triggered an immediate acceleration of the debt upon any admission of moral turpitude or legal insolvency. Sophie's confession provided the former, your bank statements provided the latter. Evan stood up, his face losing its tanned luster, turning a sickly shade of gray. Nathan, don't do this. We're brothers. Whatever happened with Sophie, it was a mistake, but this is my life. This gym is all I have. It's not yours anymore, I said, reaching into my coat and pulling out the deed of transfer. Vanguard Strategic Holdings bought your debt from the original leaseholders weeks ago. I am the sole director of Vanguard. I didn't save your business, Evan. I liquidated it. I own the equipment, the lease on this building, and the very desk you're standing behind. The silence that followed was absolute. The charming brother, the man who thrived on admiration, looked small, diminished by the weight of a ledger he couldn't manipulate. He reached out as if to grab my arm, but I stepped back, the distance between us now a permanent, unbridgeable chasm. You have 1 hour to clear out your personal locker, I said, checking my watch. At 9 p.m., the security codes will be wiped. If you're still inside, I'll have you removed for trespassing. I turned to leave, not waiting for his excuses or his rage. As I pushed open the heavy glass doors, I didn't feel the heat of revenge. I felt only the quiet, cold satisfaction of a balanced account. Evan was no longer a threat. He was just another bad investment I had successfully written off. The new office was high above the city, a space of glass and absolute silence that felt more like a sanctuary than a place of business. There were no ghosts here, no lingering scent of Sophie's perfume, no echoes of Evan's performative laughter. The walls were a cool, slate gray, and the air was stripped of the frantic humidity that had defined my life for the last several months. I stood by the window, looking down at the grid of the city. From this height, the world looked like a series of interconnected data points, manageable and logical. I had successfully navigated the liquidation of my old life. The house in the suburbs had been sold, the joint accounts were closed, and the legal ties that had once felt like a noose were now merely shredded paper in a digital archive. On my desk sat a single framed photograph, the only item I had kept from the nursery. It was a picture of Noah, taken just a few weeks after he was born. He was sleeping, his face a mask of profound, unburdened innocence. He was a child born into a theater of lies, a casualty of a war he didn't even know was being fought. I picked up a fountain pen and a trust document I had spent the morning drafting. I wasn't doing this out of sentimentality. Sentimentality is a luxury for those who can afford to be reckless, and I had seen where that path led. I was doing this because I was a man who believed in the proper allocation of resources. I signed the bottom of the page, establishing an irrevocable educational trust for Noah. It would cover his tuition, his books, and his start in life, locked away in a vault where neither Sophie's impulses nor Evan's debts could ever touch it. I didn't do it out of love for the people who had betrayed me. I did it because I was the only one left with the power to ensure a future wasn't completely squandered by the past. It was a final, executive decision, the ultimate act of a man who had reclaimed his agency. I leaned back, the leather chair creaking softly in the stillness. I thought about the man who had sat in that study 3 weeks ago, holding a manila envelope with a hand that had almost, for a second, begun to shake. That man was gone. The distance between the victim I was supposed to be and the architect I had become was now immeasurable. I had lost a wife and a brother, but I had gained something far more valuable, a clean slate, audited and verified. My life was once again a series of calculated moves and predictable outcomes. I set the pen down, looked out at the horizon, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to simply breathe. The accounts were balanced. The case was closed. I stood at the window of my new office today, looking at a city that finally makes sense again. It's quiet here. No lies, no siphoned accounts, no jagged secrets hiding in the shadows of a nursery. You know, when Sophie looked me in the eye and told me the truth about Evan and Noah, she expected me to break. She expected a scene. But she didn't realize that I had already spent 3 weeks auditing her betrayal. By the time she spoke the words, I had already moved the pieces. I had already won. If there is one vital lesson I've gained from this, one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this: precision is your greatest defense. In this world, people will tell you that emotional transparency is everything. They'll tell you to trust your gut and lead with your heart. But I've learned that when the people closest to you, the ones who know exactly where you keep your trust, decide to use that knowledge to dismantle your life, your heart won't save you. Your strategy will. I didn't survive this because I was lucky. I survived because I treated my life like a high-stakes balance sheet. I watched the data, I tracked the inconsistencies, and I stayed silent until the trap was set. I learned that you don't have to be a victim of your circumstances if you are willing to be the architect of your own justice. Betrayal is loud and messy, but the most effective response is cold, clinical, and calculated. If you value this kind of perspective, if you want to learn how to navigate the complexities of life and relationship power plays with a strategic mind rather than a shattered heart, then I invite you to stay. This channel is about more than just stories. It's about the tactical intelligence required to protect what you've built. Subscribe and join us. Let's make sure that when life tries to force a before and an after on you, you're the one holding the pen for the next chapter. I'll see you in the next video. The investigation is never truly over.